Hi, I'm Liv and welcome back to the Book Nook. So I realised after my last video that I had fully been intending to end every Norse-Vember video with Skål. And I've been forgetting, so Skål to that. So I figured I would strike while the axe is hot, as the saying doesn't go, but I've made it Norse, and I'm filming this video straight off the back of the last one, so I'll try and not get confused. So this is part 3 of the Norse reading list series I'm doing, and this one is on non-fiction, Norse non-fiction, Norse non-fiction, Norse non-fiction. As I mentioned in the last video, this is not going to be as in-depth a look at a reading list because I have not read the vast majority of these titles on this list, but I have kind of done the research for you in terms of here's a reading list of non-fiction about the Norsemen and Vikings and shit, if you want it. A lot of this will also depend how far down the rabbit hole you want to go, as it were. I've got some books that are more general Viking history, some that are more specific about specific topics, some that go more into language and linguistics. It's a mixed bag. Some of these books are very established as very recommended texts when talking about Norse history and the Vikings. Others are not, and I will talk about those. So the first couple of books I'm going to talk about are going to be a little bit further down the rabbit hole than you might go, but they work well together, so I'm going to talk about them first. And first of all, that's A Concise Dictionary of Old Icelandic by Geir T. Zoega. Now this book, as well as not working with the ring light, is dense. It's one that I've not used very much and don't know how much I will use it, but it's a really interesting book to have. It is basically exactly what it says on the tin, a dictionary of Old Icelandic. This, along with 4 different volumes published by the Viking Society for Northern Research, I think, are still considered kind of the authority on Old Norse, Old Icelandic, the language closest to that which the Vikings would have spoken. It's mainly helpful as a reference tool for words, obviously, and if you want to have a go at trying to translate stuff, which I've been trying to literally just translate little phrases and sayings, and it's just all going wrong, but I'm having fun with it. I tell a lie, the series I mentioned before by the Viking Society of Northern Research is only 3 volumes, and that is known as A New Introduction to Old Norse, and is sort of your authority on Old Norse as a language if that's something you're interested in. Tying in with that, but more specific to Norse mythology, is another book which is highly recommended. It is still quite old, but still works. And that is Rudolf Simek's Dictionary of Northern Mythology. And this is, again, exactly what it says on the tin. It is a dictionary of Norse mythology. It has all of the names that you will likely encounter when reading any of the Eddas or the sagas, with more context about them, where they are referenced, where they appear, and it's just really interesting. Again, something to just sort of flick through at leisure, or to use as a research tool or a reference tool if you were to, say, read some of the Eddas or the Hávamál in Old Icelandic. So I appreciate that those are fairly down the rabbit hole, so I thought I would mention them first. Those are all more to do with language, and linking in with that I've discovered a book by Heather O'Donoghue called English Poetry and Old Norse Myths. This is a volume that looks at the language of Old Norse poetry and the Norse myths and how that feeds into English poetry. I haven't looked into it too much, but if you're more of a linguist or more into your kind of poetry as a historical thing, then that one would be worth checking out. There is, of course, also Heather Donoghue's From Asgard to Valhalla, which I mentioned in the last video in this series talking about more Norse mythology-based texts. That one is a kind of crossover. It kind of bridges the gap between just a rendering of the myths and the history and context behind the myths and how these things were discovered and all sorts of archaeological discoveries and things, so that's one worth checking out as well. In terms of other highly recommended texts, one I have come across numerous recommendations but don't have my own copy of, and probably won't because it's quite expensive, and that is The Viking World. Now this is edited by Stephen Brink and Neil Price. So this is considered a kind of quite heavy scholarly look at the history of kind of Viking world and the state of research now, I think is one of the kind of phrases in the review. Now this was published in 2008, so maybe fairly outdated. And feeding on from that, Neil Price, one of the authors of that, has a new book out very, very recently called Children of Ash and Elm. A History of the Vikings, Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price. I would imagine, and I have got a Kindle copy of this but I haven't started reading it yet myself, and I have been reading some early reviews which seem to say it is kind of an updated version of the Viking world, which Neil Price edited with Stephen Brink. I think it's a big hardback, so again, something for Christmas for somebody who is after a book on the Vikings. It is a chunkster, it's about 620 pages, something like that, so I think it promises to be quite in-depth, and as I say, a slightly more refreshed version of The Viking World, edited with Stefan Brink. While we're on the topic of more recently published books, I'm also going to flag up a book that I have ordered a copy of and I'm waiting to pick up, and that is Valkyrie, The Women of the Viking World by Johanna Katrin Fredriksdottir. Now this is a book that, as the title would suggest, is looking at women in the Viking world. Pretty much all we kind of ever hear of in terms of Vikings in popular culture when it comes to women is usually hell. If you think of Thor, the latest one, can't remember, Ragnarok, that was it. Kate Blanchett's character, that's kind of all we get from there. We get a couple of badasses, but they are usually the Valkyries. So I think this book is not only going to look at the Valkyries themselves, but also women in the wider Viking world. Another well-reviewed, well-recommended text in terms of Vikings is aforementioned in a previous video, The Vikings by Elsa Rostal. This is one that I'm going to be reading as part of book Hibernation. And it is, as it says, the Vikings. It's about the Vikings. I mean, you can't get much simpler than that, can you? That one was first published in 1991 and this newest edition is 2016. So there's a little bit of a gap, but I don't know how much new Viking stuff's been discovered in the last 4 years. Then another general book on Viking history that you may be interested in is The Northmen's Fury by Philip Parker. This one I haven't heard as much about compared to some of the others on the list, but I think that could be because it's slightly newer than some of the more established books and not as new as some of the new ones that we're talking about. It's another book that tells the Viking story right from their sort of early sack of Lindisfarne right up to their exploring across Russia and all over the world, so that is that one. I will give another mention to Horrible Histories, Vicious Vikings, because again, I think as a basic starting off point, no idea about the Vikings. It doesn't have to be for kids, it can be for you if you just don't even know where to start and you just want to think, oh, I want to know a bit more about them, but I don't know if I want to get a big old non-fiction chunkster. Go for the Vicious Vikings. And another one which I've heard reviewed quite a lot and I picked up a copy of when I was still working in the bookshop is Viking Britain by Thomas Williams. Now, as the title suggests, this book explores the history of the Vikings as particularly pertains to Britain. So not so much going off with the Vikings as they journey all across the world and explore and colonise and do all their Viking shit, but what did they actually get up to in Britain? When did they arrive? What did they do? Where did they stay? Who did they interact with? All these kind of kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia and how they were involved in all of that. It's a period of history I know nothing about. The Vikings in general I know a bit more about, but Viking Britain and kind of heading into those Middle Ages, is that even right? I'll be totally honest, it's a period of history I know nothing about. It wasn't something that was really taught in school. All I vaguely know about it is what I got from The Last Kingdom, the TV adaptation that my dad used to watch. How the Vikings interacted and crossed over with and intermingled with and thus carried on a line of descent with those early British rulers. I don't know anything about that, so that's something to learn. Next up, a couple of books that are slightly more contemporary and not so much looking at the history as it pertains to Vikings and Norse, but a little bit more of a mixed bag. The first one is Scandinavians by Robert Ferguson. Now this deals more with Sweden, Norway and Denmark rather than sort of Iceland at all, and it's looking at the history of these three nations as Scandinavia and looking for some kind of cultural identity or spirit. It's one I picked up a while ago because I like all things Scandi and I was interested to know more and find out what I didn't know, which is a lot. But it will of course touch on the Vikings as it goes through the history of Denmark, Norway and Sweden. You can't but. And then another one that I'm kind of going to slip in, even though it's not really kind of the same as any of these books, is Names for the Sea by Sarah Moss. This is a non-fiction kind of autobiographical book about Sarah Moss's time working as a teacher in Reykjavik, and it's just about Iceland, but I just thought I'd pop it in here. Some others that come highly recommended, but I do not have my own copy of and cannot attest to, but for the sake of putting them on the reading list, there's The Age of Vikings by Anders Winroth. This one I haven't heard a huge amount about, but I have heard that it is quite a comprehensive look at the Age of Vikings. Apparently it is a fairly scholarly work. It has lots of notes and references and bibliography, so it might be a little more on the dry side if you are looking for something a little wetter. There we go again! Apparently one thing different about the Anders Winroth book as well in terms of its focus is it looks a little bit more at the Vikings' kind of interaction with the eastern side of the globe as opposed to the western side of the globe, which is kind of the prevailing thing. So it possibly will give you a look at the history that's not gone over in as much ground in other texts. If you are after something that is more kind of Western focused, which let's face it, a lot of them mostly will be primarily, but one drawn as a parallel to that would be John Haywood's Northmen, the Viking saga AD 793 to 1241. Then we have The Sea Wolves by Lars Brownworth. Now this one I've heard mixed things about, but the thing that kind of possibly would sell this one to you is that it is meant to be more of a narrative look at some of the figures through Viking history, rather than sort of facts and figures in a drier look. It's meant to be more narrative based, more characterful. So if that's how you like to get your history, that might be worth a look. Robert Ferguson has also written a book called The Vikings, A History, but I've heard quite a mixed bag about that one. I've heard that it's quite dry, and that you could almost call it a Viking history written by a Christian, that it's very kind of Christian focused, very much looking through that lens, rather than kind of looking at Vikings and Viking history as was. It's, yeah, looking through that lens and kind of a little bit judgy. Then, if you are a fan of Neil Oliver, him off the BBC, who personally I find quite annoying, he has written a book on the Vikings, again pertaining more to Britain and British history than the more general overview. It is meant to be quite readable, and as I say, if Neil Oliver is your bag, and if you like your history coming from someone who you've seen on the telly and therefore maybe feel like you trust more, then give it a go. I'm also quite intrigued and may try and get my hands on a copy of The Vikings, Facts and Fictions by Kirsten Wolf and Tristan Müller-Volmer. Now, Kirsten Wolf does the introduction for the Helen Gerber Norse mythology book mentioned in the last video. This is a book that apparently takes 11 kind of popular misconceptions about the Vikings and dissects them and tells you why they are wrong or right, but let's face it, they're probably going to be wrong. So I'm quite intrigued by that one, and I may well get my hands on a copy. Oh, having googled it and looked at the price, I don't think I'll be paying 47 quid for it, but a much more affordable book by Kirsten Wolf is The Viking Age as well, which I think is like everyday life. So it looks more at kind of the everyday life of the everyday Viking rather than particularly some of these bigger characters. See, I think the danger with compiling a list of non-fiction books about the Vikings and about Norse history, as probably with any kind of period of history, is you can go kind of too broad, you can go too narrow, and ultimately, if you're being kind of really simplistic about it, they're all going to be covering the same stuff. So I think you can't really go wrong with most of the ones that I've mentioned, but something like your Neil Price would probably be your best bet, or your Elsa Rosdahl, but hell, just give them all a go. Well, not all of them, give any of them a go. See what's your writing style as well. You may start reading some of these and think it's too dry, but please don't let that put you off the Vikings, because there ain't nothing dry about a Viking. Now there is one more book that I'm going to mention and just briefly talk about, and that is The Viking Spirit by Daniel McCoy. Now, Daniel McCoy is an interesting fellow. He is a guy who has a website called norsemythology.org. I think there's a hyphen in there somewhere, I'm not sure. But he is very good at basically kind of Google SEO results and stuff like that. He has made it so that pretty much whenever you Google stuff about Vikings, a link to his website will come up somewhere in those search results. Now, this book is self-published, and there's nothing against self-publishing, by and large, but I think when you self-publish something that's more historical, and you try to pose as, or not pose, but posit yourself as a historian or a scholar, when you're not, you're on a bit more wobbly ground. Now, I have bought this book. I have a copy. It's right here, see? When I was researching or beginning to research books about Vikings, this would come up. If you search, like, best books about Vikings, a link to his website comes up with a list of the best books about Vikings, and his is number 1. So he's a good salesman. Now, a lot of the reviews I've read of it on places like Amazon or Goodreads don't necessarily have something bad to say about it. They say it's very readable and he comes across as very knowledgeable, and there's nothing wrong with that. But critics of it, and I've done more research into this, have basically said it's kind of a regurgitated Wikipedia. He doesn't cite sources very well. Some of the sources he uses have also been kind of discredited, and they're from much older sources. He kind of contradicts himself lots of times. It doesn't seem to have quite as good a historical grounding, because this guy's not a scholar. He's not a historian. I'm not saying he doesn't know what he's talking about at all, because he's obviously done lots of research and he's obviously very into the Vikings, but if you're not a scholar and you're kind of trying to pretend that you are, or try and sell that you are, and sell that your book is the best book on Vikings, I think if you have already got this book, say, or if you've read it because it's coming up on those hits, don't feel bad. I wouldn't say feel duped either, because, you know, it's salesmanship, fine, whatever. But as with any kind of historical period that you read about, don't just read one book on it and go, sweet, I got it. He's also meant to be a little bit wishy-washy on the kind of esoteric stuff and more of the kind of runes and sigils and the spirituality stuff, which, as I say, I will talk about him more kind of in relation to some of those things. But a lot of the book, particularly in those instances, doesn't have a lot of historical grounding. So be careful with Daniel McCoy's The Viking Spirit, I would say. I think there are lots of reasons why it's readable and why, as a kind of entry-level Viking history book, go ahead and read it, but read it with a pinch of salt. I'm not using sources and things like that, I'm not putting them in line or references or what have you. Sure, it adds to the readability, but it doesn't add to the reliability. So just be careful. I admire the balls on this guy, and like the enthusiasm and the interest is there, but there are reasons why historical books or books about history go through publishers rather than being self-published. These things need editing, they need confirming and researching and all of that stuff. There's a reason they're published, not self-published. In the main. I'm not saying that, you know, books through traditional publishers will never have anything wrong with them and no facts will ever be proven wrong. Of course they won't, but the self-published history book, be wary. Or cautious, I should say. Curious yet cautious, I think, would be the key thing, I guess, when going into any history. I've been guilty of it when I started researching the Vikings and stuff. I found this guy's website, I found this guy's book, I was like, yep, cool. And the more research I did, the more people were saying, he's not all that. So, that's a big ol' heap of non-fiction Norse books for your delight, consideration, delicatessen. No, there will always be more. There'll probably be some that I've missed, some that are glaringly, blindingly obvious, but I'm a human. Are there any others that I've missed that you think absolutely need mentioning and highlighting as a good read for Norse history-liking people? Ran out of steam there. Have you read any of these? Do you have any opinions on what I've said about the whole Daniel McCoy thing? Have a little chat with me in the comments below. Next in this series will be a video on Norse and Viking inspired fiction, which I'm very excited to do. So I will see you for that one. A good evening, have a nice time, be safe and well, goodbye.